Hi everyone, welcome to week 6 of our critiques here. So we'll be looking at images from module 4, and what we're particularly looking at here is your use of focus as it relates to the depth of field and our lighting in the images. So first person on deck here is Tom, and in his first image we have a very shallow depth of field. So the reflections in the water are in focus, and the rest of the image, it looks like this is a tarp of some sort that is catching some pooling water. All of that is out of focus. What it does is it creates a very abstract photograph, and I think it engages the viewer in sort of a bit of daydreaming and wondering what this object is. To me, it almost kind of seems like an oyster on a half shell. So it has a wonderful sort of whimsy to it that I like a lot. Tom told us that he did warm this image up. When we say warm, we mean that it's moving it a little bit towards the yellows in the color palette. And I think that was a very successful decision on his part. I think it mirrors the type of light that we tend to perceive in the fall. So all in all, I like this image, very creative, love what's going on in that reflection, and I think technically speaking, you did a great job with the assignment. And then we've got your second image that has a very large depth of field, so everything from the foreground to the background is in focus. And we're also using some really hard lighting here. I'd like the use of the hard lighting because it really makes those leaves on the tree almost seem chiseled out. It gives the image a series of different planes for the viewer to perceive. So in other words, the leaves in the front seem much closer to the viewer's field of vision than those leaves all the way in the back. And I think part of that has to do with that really hard light that is giving us these very razor sharp edges on the leaves. So lighting works real well here, Tom. The one thing I do have to say is that compositionally and in terms of visual excitement, I think this image misses the mark on both counts. We've got these two lines from the trees here that take our eye into the center of the photograph. And when we have lines like this that lead our eye someplace, what we want to happen is to have something exciting being going on in the area that our eye lands on. So our eye is going here and it lands in this area. And what do we have right here? Well, we've got pretty much nothing. We've got sort of a jumbled, unorganized mess of branches. And it really doesn't say something interesting or unique or special. And in fact, I would probably say this image borders on cliche because it's something pretty much everybody does. You know, they look up at trees and point the camera sort of thoughtlessly here. So from that perspective, I'm not so crazy about this image. Again, as I will encourage everybody, I want you to be creative with your image making and have a purpose. I just don't want you out there pointing your camera at stuff and doing technical exercises to satisfy the requirements of the assignment. I'm looking for creativity. I'm looking for an advanced thought process that tries to share with the viewer something that is unique, something that they wouldn't have ordinarily seen on their own. So I hope that all makes sense to you, Tom. But still some good images here, and just keep pushing yourself, and we look forward to seeing your images next week. Next on our group of images is Christina's photograph, and she's done something interesting for us. She's gone ahead and provided us with a series of 6 images that go through a exposure test, I guess we'll call it, where she works with what is the correct exposure, or at least the correct exposure that the camera is telling us, and then she's giving us a couple images that are overexposed and a couple of images that are underexposed. So we can run through these images and first of all look at our correct exposure image here, and we can see that Peter Canisius is exposed reasonably well. We're probably missing a little bit of the details within the shadow area of the sculpture, and especially in the shadow area of the trees here. But on the other hand, we're really losing the sky. The sky is almost completely blown out here. And then if we go through the -1 exposures, we start to see that sky get richer and darker. And -1.3, again, a little bit darker, but it actually looks a little darker in the -1 than the -1.3, which is probably due to you moving the camera around. And then finally our -2 exposure here. And we probably would love to have, in an ideal world, an exposure on the sky that is -2, and then probably an exposure on Peter Canisius that is somewhere around this +2 or maybe even +1 area. One of the beautiful things about Camera Raw is that we can go in and work with some of these areas in a photograph that are either blown out or too dark. So in the next few modules in the tutorials, we'll learn about that a little bit. But I think, Christina, it's a really good exercise to do this, and I'm glad you went ahead and tried it out and shared with us your results of that. So good job on that count. The one thing that I was really looking for in this assignment also was talking about depth of field. You really didn't get into that too much in your discussion, but here we do have a large depth of field in the image. And again, in the module, it talks about how lines are important in images with a large depth of field because they help guide our eye, and certainly our eye is guided to this statue. But with all of that being said, you know, the one thing that I would offer you as a challenge is to look at this image and really tell me whether you think this is something different than anything the casual observer might see when they're walking through the quad. I would assert that it's not, and therefore it's something that again falls under that title of cliche that I throw out there a lot. Again, anybody with a cell phone camera that's walking through the quad can take this photograph. The idea behind this course is really to get you to a point where you are producing images that are different than all the other millions and millions and millions of images that are out there. And I think one of the ways that you do that is not taking the easy approach. And this is not to say that you didn't work at this assignment, but I think you're shooting from a common area, which is, you know, standing up perspective on a path that is walked by people, you know, hundreds if not thousands of times a day. So please, as you're moving forward with your assignments, try to resist the temptation to take photographs of things that are common and ordinary. And if you do feel like you have to take a picture of something like this, then I want to encourage you to try and take it in a manner that is creative and different. This certainly isn't different than many of the other shots that I've seen in the quad of this similar subject matter. So again, I know we're just sort of beginning to grow as photographers, but it's time to start pushing yourself. We are now 6 weeks into the semester, so really work at trying to give us something different. So in your second image, you give us a picture of your car. And the one thing that I do like here is we're working with some of these reflections in the surface of the paint job of the car. And I think that starts to make the image look a little bit different and gives some unique aspects to it that I think are engaging and will draw the viewer's attention in. The one thing that I'm not seeing in this image that I was hoping you would give me in at least one of your two images was an image that had a shallow depth of field. And by shallow depth of field, I'll just reassert what it was stated in the module. Shallow depth of field is when one thing's in focus and everything behind it and everything in front of it is out of focus. And the effect of that is it really leads our eye to that one thing that's in focus. So for example, in this image, perhaps you may have put the tire out of focus and the front of the car and the building in the background out of focus. In this case, I really don't see that because we've got the townhouse here in focus and the front of the car in focus and the tire in focus. So from that perspective, this really isn't a successful example of a shallow depth of field image. That being said, again, I do really like what you're doing here with the reflections. I think they're interesting. I think even as we move in a little bit closer to it, something like this, then that image really starts to become about all these different planes and levels and areas of depth to the photograph that I think the viewer can become interested in and excited about. So to summarize here, again, I think you're starting to get a little bit more creative with this image, but the technical aspect of this assignment, I think you missed the mark on. So hopefully you get a chance to revisit this idea of shallow depth of field, because I think it is a really critical thing for you to learn. And certainly if you're having problems with it, or if you have any questions, give a holler or shoot me an email and we can go over it a little bit more. And next up we have Kelly's images. Kelly has done a wonderful job in capturing that atmospheric quality that takes place right after a storm passes through here. And one of the things she tells us in her artist statement is that she used a negative exposure, or what we'll also call an underexposure here, to really emphasize the darkness and the texture in those clouds. If she had exposed this by the correct exposure, we probably wouldn't see that dramatic change in tonality and those big, heavy, weighty clouds in the sky. So I think that was a great decision on her part. This image also was taken with a wide-angle lens and a large aperture value. So all of those things combined give us this wonderful large depth of field that's going on in the image, which I think works fantastic for this shot. It really gives us a sense of how huge these clouds are and how big this storm is. So I like it a lot. I think also the fact that there's empty chairs here adds to our narrative, or adds to our story. It kind of makes the viewer wonder who is sitting there and whether they took off when the storm came through, or whether these chairs were just always placed there, or maybe even daydreaming about sitting on one of those chairs and watching the storm roll through. So I think it's a very evocative image. I think it works really well. Just one quick compositional thing that I would look at addressing. I don't like how the flagpole goes off the frame. I'd like to see you crop this frame maybe just a hair higher so we could enclose all of that flagpole in the frame. I think this just looks a teeny bit sloppy here. And remember, our eyes follow lines, and if it follows this line, it's going to go right off the page here. And the last thing you really want to have happen is to have your eye go off the frame. So just think about that a little bit. And then the other thing, perhaps you get down just a little bit lower, and by getting down a little bit lower, you're going to have more of these chairs silhouetted against the sky. So in other words, instead of having the horizon right about here, you're going to have the chairs about that high in the sky, and this is going to be up a little bit higher. So that's just a matter of taking a vantage point that's a lot lower. one that maybe is almost even laying on the ground. And that'll even make the clouds that much more dramatic too, looking up. So I encourage you to roll with that. And then your second image, you've got these wonderful bright yellow boots that are on a pretty much otherwise monochromatic palette in the background. The reflections in the water, which I'm assuming that reflection is your shape, is out of focus. So that draws our eyes directly down towards those boots. What I particularly love here is these laces that are entering the frame down here. The laces kind of mimic these strands of grass in the photograph, and it makes for sort of a whimsy little play of parts of the photograph. So I think that's very successful and works well, and kind of brings some visual interest and creativity to the image. The one thing you did mention in your artist statement here was that you were using hard lighting in this. I know the sun might have been coming out, but I think if this was hard lighting, we would see a lot darker and sharper shadows underneath your boot here. You can see the shadow is kind of diffused on the edge rather than being very hard and very sharp. So I suspect that the sun might have been out, but it probably just wasn't falling directly on your shoes there. So just kind of watch out for that. Really, the telltale sign of hard lighting is going to be those sharp-edged shadows. And you have to look where the light is falling, not necessarily what the light is. So in other words, it could be a sunny day, but if the sun isn't actually falling on that object, it's not going to be hard lighting. It's going to be soft lighting. So in other words, if it's in the shade, it's soft lighting, even though the sun is out and the sun gives us hard light. Hope that makes sense, and if it doesn't, let me know and I'll explain that further. So good work here, excellent job. Look forward to seeing your images next week.